Well, hey, everybody. We've been spending the past couple weeks talking about this idea of potential. And specifically, we've been looking at the topic of dating. And as we wrap up this series today, I want to bring you to a question. And the question is simply this: do you know someone who throws common sense out the window when it comes to dating? Do you know someone who throws common sense out the window when it comes to dating? Maybe this is somebody who's really careful with really every other area of their life, but when it comes to dating, they just want to be with somebody so bad that they tend to settle for anybody. Maybe they overlook a ton of red flags just so they can be in a dating relationship. I mean, we all kind of have that one friend, right? Who says things like, well, I know they're not perfect. And I know they've done some bad stuff in their past, but, well, they've changed. And they really like me, and they would never do that to me. And in your head, you're thinking, hasn't every person who's ever dated them said the exact same thing? You see, sometimes I think it's easy for us to throw logic out the window because we just want to be in a relationship. And it's easy for us to look at other people and to think to ourselves, well, why would you do that? Why would you settle for that person? Or do you not know how this is going to end? Or don't you know that's how it always ends? You see, dating can be a great part of your high school years. But sometimes emotional entanglement of a relationship can make things a little more challenging to see clearly. Or maybe you want to be in a relationship so bad that it can be easy to make choices that you really wouldn't otherwise. And we end up making choices that we regret because of pressure that we feel. And here's what's interesting, is that although we can see it when it's happening to other people, we often don't always see it in ourselves. You see, we tend to have the same general rules when it comes to dating. We say things like, well, we're not going to date somebody who's a cheater, or we're not going to date somebody who pulls us down or who brings us away from our values. But when we start to catch feelings for somebody, the pressure to make decisions gets a little bit higher, and the rules that we may have set for ourselves, well, they tend to become a little more flexible. And we find ourselves saying things like this: well, it's fine. It's just the way it is. Or I can control it. It won't get out of hand. Or maybe we say, I can handle the consequences. And these views can bring us to a place where we make less than great decisions. Now, we're going to look at a story from Scripture today that involves the most famous king of all of Israel, who's King David. And David has a lot of really great hits in his life. Chances are you probably know several of them. Stories like David and Goliath. And if you've ever heard of David, you probably think pretty positively about him. Because David was known as a great leader. He was even described in Scripture as a man after God's own heart. But despite all of the clout and all of the influence that he still had his downfalls. You see, the event that we're looking at today takes place when the nation of Israel is at war with the Ammonites, which was one of Israel's biggest enemies. And during that time, when the nation went to war, it was like, it was pretty normal for the kings to come out of their palace and to fight alongside their troops. But this time, David decided not to be like those other kings. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, we see it says, in the spring of the year, when the kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. It was basically like David said in this moment, nah, I'm good. You all go, fight the war, have fun. But that decision that he made had consequences that would unfold later that we're going to look at today. Because by choosing to stay home, David was essentially sending this message to his troops. I want you to go and take care of the hard stuff, but I'm just going to chill back here at my house. And that was just the beginning. Because while his army was at war, David was at home and he got bored. It's kind of like maybe when you're on summer break, school's out, and all your friends are busy. And you're sitting at home with nothing to do all day long. Your hobbies have gotten a little bit old. Maybe your screen time is way too high and you're starting to go a little bit stir crazy. That's kind of where David was. And so one afternoon, he's walking around on the rooftop of his palace where he could overlook the city and all that he ruled. And all of a sudden, he happens to look down and he notices this beautiful woman who's bathing on her rooftop, which might seem weird to us because we say, why would you have a bathtub on your rooftop? Well, back then, the rainwater would actually gather on the rooftop, so it made a lot of sense. But David never should have been on his rooftop to begin with. And you could say it this way, that the most dangerous place for you to be is any place you should have never been in the first place. And David looks at this woman and he wants to know more about her. It's obviously an abuse of power because David's the king, and in that culture, the king gets what the king wants. And in this case, he wanted her. And so you could say it this way, the most dangerous person for you to be with is any person you should have never been with in the first place. And so David wants this woman. And so he sends his men out to find out about her. And here was their report in 2 Samuel. It says, she is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite. So the messengers tell David her name. But they don't stop there. They want him to know, hey, this lady is somebody's daughter and somebody's wife. In other words, David, I got an idea of what you want, but this isn't a good idea because this woman is not just an object. She's a human being. She has a family. And she's really, let's be honest, she's not yours to have. But David didn't care about any of that. His judgment was clouded by his desires and honestly by his hormones. And so he wasn't thinking clearly about what was right or what was honoring to other people. And so it's pretty clear to see that David made a few assumptions. 3 primarily that you see here. He thinks to himself, I'm an exception to the rule. What I want isn't that bad. And I can deal with whatever happens as a result. So without any question, both as a human being and as a leader, and let's be honest, a king chosen to lead God's people, for crying out loud, David abuses his power. He has Bathsheba, a married woman, brought to him. He has sex with her. And it's highly likely that in this sexual encounter, it was forced by David. And from this sexual encounter, Bathsheba becomes pregnant. In other words, you could say that at every turn, David seems to think that he's an exception to the rules. But he isn't. David isn't above right and wrong. There are very real consequences when we all make poor decisions, and David was no exception to that. He could have stopped at any point. He could have owned up to his blatant selfishness, to his sin. And things, wouldn't have gotten worse, potentially. But he didn't. His abuse of power continues to snowball. And so David decides, when he finds out that Bathsheba is pregnant, to call Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, home from war and try to get Uriah to sleep with his wife. Because he thinks, well, if he comes home and he sleeps with his wife, then everyone would say the baby is Uriah's and not mine, and I would be off the hook. Now, we're getting into some real reality television show right here area, right? But when Uriah gets home, he doesn't feel like it's right for him to sleep in his own bed while his friends and his fellow soldiers are fighting a war. And so he sleeps outside the palace. And so David thinks, okay, now I've got to try again. And so he invites Uriah over for dinner, hoping to get him really drunk so that he would go home and sleep with his wife. But Uriah still won't go back to his house. And so now David is really desperate to hide what he's done because he knows this is just going to continue to escalate. And so he gives Uriah an order as he goes back to war. And he tells the commander to place Uriah on the front lines where the fighting is the most dangerous. Because David's like, hey, if I can't cover up Bathsheba's pregnancy and what I did, then Uriah needs to be taken out of the picture completely. And that's what happens. Uriah goes to the front lines, he's fighting, he's killed. And afterwards, David takes Bathsheba as one of his wives. Now, for those of you that are keeping score, it's not a stretch to say that David is lazy, irresponsible as a military leader. He becomes a peeping Tom, an abuser, an adulterer, a liar, a mobster, a murderer. I mean, the list could go on, just so we're clear and all on the same page. And as we listen to this story, we say, what was he thinking? Those are terrible decisions. And that's very true. But what happens in this story is a much discussed and much debated story in faith circles. Because there's this constant discourse of, well, who was at fault? Was it really rape? Was David really a monster? And in all of that, something really critically important is lost. It seems to kind of fade into the background. And that's what we want to focus on and what we need to bring into focus today. Because what we need to bring back into focus is the sobering reality that the value and respect of humanity of Bathsheba in this instance is diminished. Somehow we tend to make David the focus of this story. And Bathsheba, even though her life is sent into a state of upheaval and loss and pain, heartache, all those things, it kind of becomes an aside. And Bathsheba really becomes diminished. But it's been said this way, that history is written by the victors, but it's the victims who write the memoirs. Bathsheba would have penned an amazing memoir to this story. And it's her story and her pain that echoes to teach us an invaluable lesson. Now, there are probably times where what we want or what we think we need or all those things completely cloud our need and our capacity to value other people. Maybe we haven't been nearly as extreme as this story, but we're all capable of getting stuck in a storm because we've created the weather. If we had slowed down and we had gotten honest with ourselves, maybe we had a bit of perspective, then maybe things wouldn't go downhill so fast. But sometimes when the pressure is on, we lose perspective. Or you could say it this way. We can convince ourselves that we're the exception. We believe that we won't have regrets or that we won't get caught or we can turn it around, we can make it right. We won't turn out like everybody else. We have a relationship that other people just can't possibly understand. We're in denial. And if we aren't careful, we end up making a lot of bad decisions just like David did. And without even realizing it, we don't think that there's another person paying a very steep price for our selfishness. You see, over and over again, David was asking, what else can I get away with? And how can I avoid the consequences? Every decision that he made was through that perspective. And because he was the only person speaking into his decisions, he did things that he knew he shouldn't just to get what he wanted. And he went to such lengths that Bathsheba's value and well-being and feelings never seemed to be a consideration. Because when we believe that we're an exception to the rule, or we feel like, well, I can't be okay without a relationship, we end up justifying bad decisions and bad situations. And we can tell ourselves, well, those things are okay even when they really aren't. And this is a temptation that we all can face. Because the truth is, the pressure to be with someone can cause you to settle for anything. When we end up settling for situations or people or relationships that aren't the best for you or the other person, and especially when the pressure that we're under is self-imposed, because we cannot lose sight of this, that settling for anything can mean that all the while fading into the background is a person, is somebody with intrinsic value on the other side of our misplaced desire, that we may be hurting deeply. So when it comes to dating, it helps to be honest with yourself and ask the right questions. We need to ask questions like, is there any area where we feel pressured to get something or to do something that we don't actually need? Is there any area where we find ourselves thinking that may be true for everybody else, but it's surely not true for me or for us? Is there anything that makes you think that you have things under control, even when everybody else is telling you differently. So you may be wondering, well, is that how the story of David and Bathsheba ended? No. David eventually realizes that he was wrong, but he didn't do it alone. It took somebody else speaking up and David being willing to listen. Because sometimes seeing things clearly can take someone being real and honest with us, even when it isn't easy. But it also takes us being willing to listen. So this week, I want to encourage you to do 3 things. First is find someone to speak into your dating life. This could be a wise friend, or it could be a small group leader, a parent, a teacher, a coach. It could be a trusted adult. Think about people in your life who you trust, and then identify somebody that will be completely real with you. Second, ask them to help you see areas where you're not honest with yourself or facing truth in your life. Now, this part isn't easy. It might even be scary. And it's not like you have to share the deepest, darkest secret to start, but you do have to start somewhere. And chances are they'll be able to see things just by knowing you. And then third, listen to them. Even if you find somebody you trust and they have all the wisest things to say, that wisdom is wasted if you won't listen. So make a decision to give this person a chance, to say what they see, to always be honest with you, even when, and especially when, it's something you may not want to hear. Because if you don't want to hear their thoughts on the situation, there's a good chance you need to. So let me ask you a few difficult questions. Do you have someone to help you gain perspective as it relates to your relationship? Are you being honest enough with yourself to let someone in who will help you reach the most potential in both your dating life and in your life in general? Are you perhaps manipulating a relationship for personal gain? And have you convinced yourself that it's no big deal? And this question is tough. Much like David, are you abusing your own power or popularity? Maybe you really need to let somebody in. And to be honest, this will save you a lot of pain later. And I'm not talking about like 10 years from now. That is possible. But I'm saying it can save you a lot of regret and baggage in the weeks or months to come. Because the reality is all of us can end up in a million places that we didn't want to be simply by accident. All because we never asked the tough questions and made the difficult decisions. But to end up where you want to be, both in dating and relationships and in your life, to see the potential in the person that you date, you need to be honest with yourself, and you need to let somebody else be honest with you as well. Now remember, the pressure to be with somebody can cause you to settle for anything. And God doesn't want you to settle, He wants you to thrive.